I'm the programs manager for the Women's Academy for Leadership and Political Excellence. Today, we have a panelist of 4 renowned Zimbabwean and a South African who is joining us on the panel. We are discussing the topic, the Zimbabwean crisis, what needs to be done, women as solution holders. So I will introduce to you the facilitator, who is also the World Board Chairperson, Ms. Lucy Chivasa. Lucy, I'll hand over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome
to coming in. Let me just remind you that this meeting is a continuation, a consultative forum where we are asking for positions of for the solutions, where we are asking for solutions to the Zimbabwean crisis to women from all over the world, be it Zimbabwean women or South African women. So this process will culminate into the production of a position paper, which will produce and share with policyholders and solution holders in order for us to find a solution for the crisis that we are having in Zimbabwe. I will hand over to Lucy to take over the process.
Thank you very much, Batanai, and welcome to everyone. I'll just start by giving a brief background of what our organization is about for the benefit of those that are joining us and hearing about us for the very first time. Our organization is based in Zimbabwe, and our core mandate is to capacitate women leaders so that they take up spaces. So what we do is we identify, groom and nurture women leaders who aspire to occupy public office. And we do this through capacity building, mentorship, and coaching. So today, like Badanai said, it is very important that we get to discuss about the Zimbabwean crisis and what us as women can do to become part of the solution. So once again, good morning to you all and welcome to the discussion. I think from my end, I'll just follow as I facilitate this discussion. From my end, I'll just follow the list of participants as they are coming in, as they are coming from my screen. And firstly, I think this first round, I'm just going to give all the panelists about 5 minutes to speak briefly in general about our topic, and then we'll get maybe to answer questions and to address specific things. But as we start the discussion, I'll just go straight to Jana and ask you what you can say, or your thoughts generally around the situation in Zimbabwe and what you think women can do in terms of the have a part to play in that. And we just go around and people, the panelists can have what to say about the topic.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you to the Women's Academy for Leadership and Political Excellence. It's really, for me, very important, and I think something to celebrate, that we create spaces where we engage with women as thought leaders, as intelligentsia, as people who have proposals and ideas and solutions to put forward in the resolution of the challenges that Zimbabwe is facing and has been facing over time. I really like the idea of bringing together women to talk, think, discuss, and strategize together. So I really want to commend this and appreciate also the National Citizens Convention for allowing this space to be created. I think, yes, it's really so important for us to continue to talk about the Zimbabwe. What I don't think is that we continue calling it a crisis. But it's the challenges that Zimbabwe has been facing protracted over time. But if I was to summarize it, I would say the Zimbabwe crisis is a confluence of multiple negative occurrences that are political, economic, environmental, cultural, and social for over years that have been happening over this country. And what is really sad, I think, is that we're this for the last 20 to 25 years, it feels like as a country we are caught up in a time warp ago. We still find that are happening today in all these spheres that I've alluded to, politically, economically, socially, and culturally. Still the same issues that we are facing today that we're facing in the year 2000, for instance. When I think about our country and how in 1980 it was such a big moment when this country got independence from colonial rule. And 1980 signified, I think, for me, a big moment where, as Black African Zimbabweans, won the right to govern themselves and won what we were calling at that time democracy. It was about establishing a government of the people, by the people, and for the people. And to me, in summarizing all the challenges that we face, if I was to summarize it to one issue, it really sits on this premise that our country was founded on what was right for the people of this country. And what I think is the biggest challenge and the biggest crisis of all is the fact that the people are no longer the center of all these spheres that affect our country. And in all these sectors, the people have been eliminated. So if you look at it, be it the government, be it the ruling party, be it the opposition parties, and sadly, in some instances, even between, be it the civil society and some of the developmental sector, the people have been removed from it. And so the biggest crisis we face as a country is the fact that the people are not front and center, and the reason for the things that we are doing, and the reason for how we are governing, the reason for the laws and policies that are being put in place, the reason for the formation of the institutions that have been put in place in our country. And if I was to dig deeper, just to further prove my theory, if you look at the moment, right, at the state and situation of the people of Zimbabwe, and then if you assess the different ways with which our politics is evolving, our economy is setting up institutions, and the language we are using to define and engage on our challenges, you'll see that the people are not centered of it. If you look at the state and situation of the people of Zimbabwe at the moment, over 7 million people in this country are food insecure. And the COVID situation has actually further confounded that situation, right? Over 70% of the people of Zimbabwe this year have been declared to be poor. And over 38% of these people are said to be extremely poor, which basically means they really do not have the ability and capacity to even just basically take care of their basic needs, particularly food, yeah? And if you look at our population at the moment, 60 to 65% of our population lives in the rural areas, in rural Zimbabwe, which basically means a lot of your developmental infrastructure like electricity and water and sanitation are things that they do not have basic access to. Of over 60% of those people are women and girls. And when you then look at the demographics and the dynamics of our country, I always say, if you want to talk about the person who's at the bottom rung of our poverty, it will be a Black person, it is a person based in a rural area, it is a female person who is young, and they're probably living with a disability, they've limited education, they have no access to clean water, no access to sanitation, and they are probably food insecure and are who we are defining as extremely poor. So when you think about how our politics is evolving, be it in ZANU-PF, be it in the MDCs, whichever one, and any other political platforms you can think about in this country, do you see them operating from a place where they are thinking about how their policies, how their procedures, how they conduct themselves, how they communicate, are they thinking about this person at all? And I think that actually for me is what is the biggest crisis in this country, that we have removed the people of Zimbabwe, the ordinary person of Zimbabwe, who is the majority. This country runs around the elite, the politically elite more so, and of course the elite that particularly belongs to the current ruling party. I'm sure we'll talk about all the other, we're going to deeper into the politics and economic issues. What needs to be done? What needs to be done? Oh, that's a really big one. And I think many times, even as a people ourselves, we have now tended to look at the other ones who have and expect solutions to emerge out of them. Part of why this conversation is really, really important is that it forces us to recognize that what needs to be done is literally in the hands of us as the people. We need to gain back our agency as people. We need to gain our agency even as women, which is why I was celebrating the creation of a space like this where we strategize together. And we need for ourselves to formulate and propose the solutions that we see to be right for ourselves as a people, and not allow our solutions to be defined for us by the political elites who definitely do not have our interests at heart. I think that's what I'll say for opening, Lucy, and I'm quite positive we'll delve deeper into other issues.
Okay, thank you very much, Jana, for that detailed analysis of what you perceive to be a crisis in Zimbabwe. And I think I agree with you that almost everyone, it looks like we're trying to find a solution, but then we're not putting the subjects as the center of the crisis that we are talking about. I'll also then pass to Malaika I'll also kindly, before we go to Malaika, I would like Batanai to say something that we overlooked when we started. Back to you, Batanai, before we move to Malaika.
Thank you, Lucy. This is just to welcome those that are joining us. When we started, there were other people who were not with us. Thank you for joining us. Also to mention that we are here for the National Citizens Convention program, where we are discussing the Zimbabwean solution, women as solution holders, what needs to be done. Thank you for joining us. We are hoping to have a fruitful discussion and at the end have solutions to how we can tackle the Zimbabwean solution. And thank you, Jana, for that very insightful proposition on what you think can be proposed to the crisis that Zimbabwe has. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Batanai. I will ask Malaika to also just in brief give us your thoughts on the discussion that we are doing, and also for the benefit of those that are joining us, that you just also maybe under 1 minute tell us about yourself before you get into the topic, so that the viewers also get to know you.
Okay. So thank you very much to the Women's Academy for Leadership and Political Excellence for this very generous invitation to this discussion. And I will explain later why I think this is a generous invitation. So my name is Malaika Mahlatsi. I am a South African national and citizen working in the Office of the Executive Mayor in the city of Ekurhuleni as a senior specialist researcher. I'm also an award-winning best-selling author. as well as a feminist and an activist. And I think it's in that regard that I am part of this conversation. I've been very greatly involved in a number of initiatives across the continent that are geared towards a Pan-African developmental agenda and a feminist agenda. And I'm a geographer by profession as well. So that is me in brief and in summary. So with regards to this, when I said earlier on that I think this is a generous invitation, it is on the basis that I think that when you are an outsider in a particular sense of the word, right, and you are invited into a space where citizens and peoples of a particular country or space are discussing issues that affect them, and you are invited into that space, it's really something very honorable. But I want to be very deliberate, that in as much as I'm very thankful for this invitation, I also want to say that being a South African myself, right, I do have my own opinions about Zimbabwe. It is a country I hold very close to my heart, but it's a country also where I worked. In 2013, I served in the SADC election observer mission, the youngest observer, in fact, in those harmonized elections. So I'm quite very familiar with Zimbabwe. It's a place whose politics and geo-history is close to my heart. But ultimately, I am a South African, right? And in as much as the Zimbabwean diaspora question is very closely linked to the politics and even the very future and past and the present of South Africa, I don't want to claim monopoly over what I think ought to be the solutions to the Zimbabwean crisis as it pertains, because I do think that there really are no such things as people who have got outsiders who've got the ideas or who are going to be the liberators and so on. It's always the people who liberate themselves, and it's always the people that I think are always best suited to define and articulate their own challenges, because they live it. It's their lived experience. It's not a reflection made from a bird's eye perspective. So I'm just going to just outline that I do think that it's an honor to be here, but I also don't want to be very I don't want to be expected to have what I think ought to be the solutions. I think it's a very problematic idea. That I'll have other reflections on other things, but perhaps not necessarily solutions for Zimbabwean people in Zimbabwe. I'll talk about what solutions can be for us in the diaspora in assisting with solidarity work for Zimbabwean people. So look, I think I agree with Jana, who argues that the Zimbabwean problem or crisis is one that is a confluence of a myriad of other issues, right? Myriad of historical and prevailing issues. And this is, reflective in the very nature of the argument that you posed. I think it's a very correct argument, that you look at it from a socio-economic perspective, right? You look at the disenfranchisement that has been happening in Zimbabwe over a long period of time, largely as a result of a collapse of institutions, of a normalization of a culture of corruption, maladministration, and the misappropriation of state funds, as well as a culture in which violence has become very normative, right? I think that, if I were to really summarize the Zimbabwean crisis in one word, for me, the word is violence. And violence not only in the sense of an army being in the middle of the streets, physically assaulting people, but violence that is very deeply systematic and embedded in the very fiber of the Zimbabwean society and its DNA. And this is what I mean by this, right? When a country such as Zimbabwe, you have got an unemployment rate that is standing at over 80%, right? And the people who are largely affected by this are young people, and largely, as Jana correctly says, women in rural areas. Then the violence that is happening there is a systematic violence that disenfranchises and hurls people at the margins of existence, right? But you also have a violence in which a ruling party has become a metonymy of the state, right? It's becoming a metonymy of the state and everything else, right? The embeddedness of the ZANU-PF in all institutions in society, including the judiciary, including even the private sector, is one that facilitates and enables a situation in which, the organization can then have a monopoly of violence that then it facilitates, or that it gets manifested through the state, as well as a monopoly of deciding on who gets to be a beneficiary of the patronage that so greatly defines the Zimbabwean social, political, and economic milieu, right? But another crisis that also confronts Zimbabwe is a crisis of a political system that thrives on what Jana correctly argues as the deliberate systematic exclusion of the people who matter, the people who are at the center of what ought to be, of what people who ought to be at the center of changing and redefining the narrative in Zimbabwe, being largely excluded. And this includes not only Zimbabweans who are already in the country, who are held on in the periphery, but also Zimbabweans in the diaspora, right, whose voices, whose activism, right, whose capacity to meaningfully engage change in Zimbabwe is being largely ignored by systems that don't even enable and make allowance for them to have a say insofar as the government of their choosing. So in many ways, what that creates, therefore, is a government that is illegitimate, right? Because the government that is not reflective of the will of the people, and the people all over, not just in Zimbabwe, but those in the diaspora. And I think for me, the diaspora question becomes then very important, because you've got millions of Zimbabweans, at least about 6 or so million Zimbabweans who are in the diaspora across the world, right? A significant number of them being in South Africa and across the SADC region and the continent, as it were. And I think that for me, as a South African, as an activist, and as one who's very deeply committed to the cause of the Zimbabwean people, and who believes that it should and it must triumph, I think the role of women in particular, right, in the diaspora, the women's movement in the diaspora, ought to be that of creating spaces in which Zimbabwean women and Zimbabwean people in their entirety are going to be given, a platform to air their, to air their politics and to participate in meaningfully changing Zimbabwe. And what this means is that, there's often people who argue that, we as people who've got positionality in the diaspora must speak on behalf of Zimbabweans. I don't think that's a correct argument, right? Because I don't think, hello? Okay, I don't think that's a correct argument, right? Because I don't think that Zimbabwean people are voiceless. And I don't think that Zimbabwean people are helpless. I think Zimbabwean people are not voiceless. They have been deliberately silenced, and it benefits a ruling party and a status quo that is deeply problematic and violent to have them appear as voiceless and helpless. So I think our role as the women's movement in the diaspora, right, as the women's movement across all of these countries on the continent and elsewhere, ought to be that of creating networks of solidarity that are going to give a space for Zimbabwean women and for Zimbabwean people in their totality to then begin to articulate the shaping of the narrative of what ought to then happen in Zimbabwe. It can't be us who bring the solutions, but we must then create those platforms. We must make it safe for Zimbabweans in South Africa to hold their government accountable. We must be able to participate in meaningful, productive, and actual solidarity work, whether it be assisting Zimbabwean people in our country to be protected even from our own government that is very problematic, whether it's being actively participating in protests, in movements and so on that highlight their plight. That's what I think ought to be done in the diaspora. And of course, the issue of resources also becomes very important. We need to be able to then raise resources that are going to assist the women in Zimbabwe who are fighting, who are in very many ways holding that country together, to then be able to access and have availability of these resources to do their work meaningfully and productively.
Thank you very much, Malaika, for that detailed analysis of what you perceive to be a crisis in Zimbabwe and what you think the women in Zimbabwe can do. And even I like the fact that you're also talking about citizens who are in the diaspora, that they also have a part to play. And though the systems that we have in place discourage them from participating, I get it clearly from your submissions that the people will liberate themselves, that the people ought to be the solutions, and it also to be part of the solution. And it also goes to, it deals with what Jana said, that the core business, or the reason why we are discussing about this crisis and the reason why we are trying to find solution about the Zimbabwean crisis, is that the people need to be part of the solution. Thank you very much for that. And then our next speaker from my side will be Sam Kelly. I'll just ask you to briefly introduce yourself and also to tell us in brief what you think is, or what you perceive to be the Zimbabwean crisis, and what you think is the place of women in this whole crisis.
Okay, thank you very much, Lucy. Thank you for this opportunity that you've given me to be one of the panelists. I'm used to being the one that listens to other people's voices and their thoughts on the issue that we're facing in Zimbabwe. So I'm really uncomfortable today because I'm like, what am I going to say? But thank you so much. You have started an incredible platform for women, to participate in being the solution holders, because what's happening in Zimbabwe affects us, the girls and women, the most. So my name is Amgeso Chuma. As you have said, I'll speak on my work, the work that I do, which is amplifying the voices of girls and young women on socioeconomic issues, political and cultural issues. I'm an advocate for the inclusion of girls and women in every decision-making process and in political processes. So I will just say that. And for me, the Zimbabwean crisis, to be honest, is more on how we as citizens have normalized what's happening in Zimbabwe. We have seriously normalized not having water. I come from Bulawayo, where we haven't had water for 3 months. And what have we done as citizens? We've just normalized, we've adapted to the point where we're now buying water for $2, $2, 25 liters for $2. So for me, the biggest crisis in Zimbabwe is us normalizing the situation. Because in other nations, especially in South Africa, you will not see people doing that. You will not see them normalizing what is abnormal. And the crisis in Zimbabwe is abnormal. I like what Jenna said, that this is a confluence of various crises in Zimbabwe. Oh, sorry, you can't hear me. Okay. Hello, can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Okay. All right. So should I start? Lucy? Okay, thank you.
Go ahead,
so I was saying that we have normalized the abnormalities in Zimbabwe, and that's the biggest crisis, because in other nations, especially developed countries, you'll not see citizens just relaxed and hoping for a savior, So we need, as Zimbabweans, to articulate our crisis. And besides articulating our crisis, what are we going to do? We can't allow the government, we can't allow this system to keep abusing the citizens of Zimbabwe. So I think with Zimbabweans, we're waiting for saviors. We're waiting for international organizations to come and help us and give us solutions. So I'm happy that WELP has given us the mandate as women to say, you know what, we're going to solve our issues. And I'm always challenged by women who went and fought for the liberation struggle. They went because they recognized that, no one was going to save us. No one was going to deliver freedom and liberation for us. So they went and they fought. So us as young women and us as women in general, what are we doing? I feel like we're hoping for political parties to do that. But the crisis in Zimbabwe needs each and every person. It needs each and every one of us to participate. It needs each and every one of us to come together and provide solutions. And I know most of us are not comfortable when we talk about civil disobedience, but I'm one of those that advocate for civil disobedience in Zimbabwe. I'm always inspired by women like Sally Mugabe, the late former First Lady of Zimbabwe. They were not happy with the system, and they organized as women, to participate in civil disobedience. But what's happening with us currently? As I said, I'm from Bulawayo, and we haven't had water for 3 months. We haven't had water for 3 months. What are we doing? There's no civil disobedience. And what we have done as Zimbabweans, when we realize that other people are standing up, the activists, we're the first ones to put them down. We're the first ones to say they're being paid to speak against the government. So for me, the crisis really, as Zimbabweans, we need to be honest about, are we really, really happy with what's going on? Are we saying that what's happening in Zimbabwe is okay? I always hear on like when I engage with various people, they always say that Zimbabweans have not suffered enough. And they're being truthful when they say that, because it's time for us as Zimbabweans to stand up and not wait for saviors. We need to stand up. We need to show the government that we are not happy, because these people, we elected them. because we can spend the whole day articulating the crisis. We all know the crisis in Zimbabwe, even the government, even those that are from the elite, they know the situation in Zimbabwe. They know that we have a crisis in Zimbabwe. So we can have all these platforms to speak on the crisis. But the key important thing for me right now is, what are we going to do about it? What are we doing about it? When we ask that question, what needs to be done? For me as a young woman, because I've been robbed, and I know many more young women have been robbed of their destinies, of their future. So for me, I can only speak on civil disobedience. We can learn from other nations. What did they do? How did they make sure that their government listened to their plight? Because we elect these people. You know, we are the ones that give them the power to rule the nation. But now we have allowed them to take the power from us, and they've imprisoned us, honestly. So we need to think about civil disobedience. We need to think about demonstrations. We need to think about speaking against what's happening in Zimbabwe. And we should not wait for one person to speak, but we need collective voices as Zimbabweans. You know, that's what we need as Zimbabweans. We need to fix Zimbabwe, because Zimbabwe is ours. And I'm happy that we have someone from South Africa, Malaika. But like what she said, that she cannot really say much about Zimbabwe, because like about the solution for Zimbabwe, because she's not here. So the solution is from us. It's time for us as Zimbabweans to stand up. That's what I can say for now, because I'm getting heated up, because I really believe that we need to think about civil disobedience in Zimbabwe, especially women, because we are the ones that bear the brunt of what's going on in Zimbabwe. We are the ones that have children that are dying in hospitals. We are the ones that have to wake up every day in the morning to look for water. We are the ones that have to give sexual favors just to get a basic right, which is water. When the Constitution clearly says that water is our right. So we need to stand up as women. We need to think about forming solidarity networks among women. And we can't wait for just one woman. We can't just wait for one woman. We need to stand up. That's what I can say for now.
Thank you very much, Samkeliso. I also feel the sentiments that you have, that as a people, as Zimbabweans, we have gotten to a place whereby we think our solution is going to come from some other people, and we are just seated there and waiting for people to help us. As we go into the discussion, we'll also then analyze whether that's the general feeling or there are other reasons why people are not taking the power. And I hope that as we discuss and deliberate and unpack the topic, we also get to speak about why as women or as Zimbabweans, we have gotten into this place where we can't liberate ourselves from the things that we talk about, the things that we criticize and say this is not well, and we are not really doing anything. So if we may just quickly move to Thabiso, as you give us your brief introduction and what you perceive to be the Zimbabwean crisis.
Oh, sorry, just realized I had muted. So thank you so much, Lucy, for this opportunity. And thank you so much to Walpe for organizing this. I think this opportunity came at a critical time where we have all of those things that are happening around us. And we really need to find ourselves at a place where we actually talk about the very uncomfortable conversations, but very critical. So yeah, I'm Thabiso Svanda. I work in the field of women's health, sexual reproductive health, maternal health, and all the other aspects of public health, but with the main focus on women and how health affects women. So someone may really argue to say, what is the relevance of someone who works within a health sector and political issues? But at the end of the day, we need to know that politics sets the pace for everything. So it is important for us then to find ourselves in spaces where we talk about those things. So I work with adolescent girls and young women. I've worked for a couple of organizations that do programming around sexual reproductive health, around advocacy for services, around advocacy for dignified commodities for adolescent girls and young women. And also right now I'm currently working for an organization called Development Agenda for Women and Girls in Africa. So I would like to say that all of the women that have spoken before me, Jana, Malaika, and Samgeli, so have actually taken the words right from my mouth, because this crisis that we have in Zimbabwe is the fact that we have been conditioned to settle. Everyone has been conditioned to settle for mediocre. We have been conditioned to believe that there's a silver lining somewhere in the cloud. We have been conditioned to believe that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. So all we need to do is just wait and wait for things to improve. And at the end of the day, we get so comfortable with all those things. Someone out there in the world is watching and they actually see it, but then they are wondering, are these people actually seeing these things going on as challenges, or they're actually comfortable? So I think, first of all, the fact that we have been conditioned to be so comfortable is very, very deadly. And it's actually one of the reasons why we have been feeding this animal and it's bursting. It's not something that just started now. It's something that has been recurring. But at the end of the day, we find ourselves slowly adjusting to the temperature, slowly adjusting, and we just settle. So one of the important things that we need to know, especially as women, is how all the crisis that is happening in this country wears the face of a woman. Sange talked about the issue of water. I also come from Bulawayo. I remember this other day, I was very frustrated to say that everything wears a face of a woman, really. We don't have water. There is no water, right? Yeah, maybe we might have men doing something about it, but at the end of the day, when you're at home, it's your responsibility as a woman, it's your responsibility as a girl child to see that things are flowing. This is unpaid care, even that is even more than some of the work that we do in our offices, but we're still stand there and we're still quiet. We still allow men to go and lead us. We still allow men who have no idea of all the other situations that we go through as women to still to speak on our behalf, because we do not want to find ourselves voices, because we choose not to say something. And I think the biggest betrayal of all times is remaining quiet when you actually can say something, when you have to say something. But as women, we have been made to believe that the space is not for us. Maybe our space is somewhere there, quiet, looking all cute and everything. And the moment we start saying something, the world will look at us at a different in a different view, and at some point we want to settle for the conditions that the society has placed for us. And I think that's one of the greatest challenges that we have as women. I would also want to say maybe the conditions and the environment around us is also not enabling as women for us to stand up for our rights. You want to look at how civil activists, you want to look at how politicians are subjected to crackdowns, they are victimized and everything. And so already there is some perception that the political space in Zimbabwe is not for women. It's not for young women, actually, so to say, because we have all of those injustices that I'm believing we are going to talk about as we continue on young women in politics. So you have women who are then there in those high places who are probably on someone's ticket, and when you're on someone's ticket, you cannot voice out, you cannot say anything. So you are made to be dormant, you're made to just sit there and do nothing about it. So I think it's one of the biggest crises that we actually have in this country, and there is a lot that we need to do as women to emancipate ourselves and find ourselves a space and find ourselves ourselves a voice and be able to also speak out and shape the Zimbabwe that we want for our daughters, because we are setting a precedence here. We are setting a precedence for the next generations to come. It's not just about us, it's about the next women that are going to come, to say, have we created the right path for them? Have we navigated the road for them to be able to then also be active citizens? Yeah, so I think that's what I can say for now. And what needs to be done, I think we really need to reflect as women. We really need to reflect across women, across political divide. We need to reflect on what is it that we want as women? What do women want? We need to form this movement, because I know we have a lot of movement, but what I've seen so far is there is selective solidarity according to whose benefit it is, according to which political party. We want to be politically correct. At the end of the day, we compromise our position as women because we do not see what happens as an attack to us women. We just look at it and we individualize cases and we say, oh, okay, so if that's her problem, then it's not my problem because I'm still safe. Not bearing in mind that if a certain woman can be subjected to such torture and violence, it can be you can be the next woman. So at the end of the day, we really need to have genuine movements that are going to create the solidarity across, and we know that this is not just an attack on a person, but it's an attack to us as women. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Thabiso. That's a very interesting thing that you raised, to say as women we are affected differently by the crisis, and we need not to individualize things, and we need to come together as sisters. We need to be each other's keeper. We need to identify our problems. We need to take everyone as we try to find the solutions. And for me, that's very important. It's a very important point that you raised right there, to say we don't need to individualize problems, and we also need to be part of the solution. I'll also then get into a kind of structured discussion as I try and pick and fasten the things that you raised as you were talking about how you perceive the Zimbabwean crisis. And I would also want to just say, not from this panel, but from the news and from the things that we see in this country, we see that Zimbabwe has had a lot of problems that are socio-economic, political, corruption. We have a lot of problems in Zimbabwe that we can put into this bracket to say there is a crisis in Zimbabwe. And I would love to maybe hear from you, Gianna, what you think is the root cause of these problems that we have in Zimbabwe. Because for us to be able to identify the solutions and to be part of the solutions, like you said when you were putting up your analysis, to say, you know, you feel that as Zimbabweans, we are leaving behind the people who are supposed to be the core of why are we in a crisis and how are we getting in a crisis, how are we going to get out of the crisis. We need to also look at the root cause. Like what do you think is the root cause of our problems? All of them, the ones that we've spoken about and the ones that we see in the media and everything.
Thanks, Lucy, for that very small and very easy to answer question. So while the challenges we experience as a people and a country manifest, as I said, politically, economically, culturally, socially, and I think the other speakers have articulated so extremely well the many other dimensions in terms of even how globally we are located, and I think some of the things that have become the symptoms of the challenge we face as a country. My perception and analysis of it is really, it comes down to how we are governed as a people. Literally coming from when we gained independence and evolving into so-called self-governance as Black African people over our country. the systems of governance that were adopted right from then, which were entrenched also in the constitution we inherited at independence, were problematic. And I think in the early to mid 90s, we took up the challenge of pushing for a new constitution, because at that time we then really believed that, right, if we create a different infrastructural setup for how this country is run, which is what our constitution ought to give us, if we ourselves define the norms and standards that ought to govern our country, would really find ourselves beginning to enjoy what our mothers, fathers, grandparents, uncles, aunties fought for in the Liberation War. And that's what birthed the fight for a new constitution in this country. We have since adopted a new constitution with a fantastic document in our 2013 constitution. And with that adoption, there was an assumption, right, that, if we now have this, then, the country will be run differently in a manner that enables all of us to enjoy our rights, our dignity as a people. We haven't seen that. We also problematized a lot of the issues we had as a country around Robert Mugabe. I was part of the movement that started the Mugabe must go mantra in the early 2000s, the Red Card movement in the early 2000s, where we were quite clear that the problems of our country were evolving around this human being called Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and he had to go. Well, he stayed for significantly longer than we wanted, but he eventually went. And here we are, 2-3 years after he has gone, and now he has even, died. And we are still here. And so, yeah, there's a truly fundamental issue for me in how we are governed, including the way our governance is structured and the way it manifests. And it is largely, for me, honestly, extremely political, because a lot of the decision-making that has been made, be it economically, be it in the laws and policies that run this country, I think the culture that was spoken of violence that is manifest in every dimension of our lives, it's through the people who are ruling us and who are governing this country. So we have a governance issue. And then when you delve deeper into that specific spectrum, you then look at who is governing us. And I think Malaika spoke extremely well about the ruling party, which has been ruling in this country since independence. And now, 40 years later, it's still in place, running this country. Clearly has not done a good job, because here we are as a people feeling extreme pain, feeling hurt, feeling disenfranchised, starving. So to me, that's where it largely sits. This is not to say our opposition parties have necessarily done any better, in my opinion. I think they too have failed us. So when I talk about governance, for me, my problem is not only the ZANU-PF machinery, it's really our political system in this country and the type of political parties that are manifesting in it. And if anything has to change, that is what has to change. ZANU-PF, in my opinion, does not hold the solutions that are required to get this country to live a dignified life. Neither do the MDCs, whichever one of them. And to my knowledge, none of any of the other political parties that exist, whether the ones that we know or don't, hold that. There's something new and fundamental we need to create. So I love this conversation, because it's then telling us we as a people need to go back and introspect and rethink and repropose. I truly believe we need different types of political platforms and a different type of political system that we can couch to manifest and create a different political process, different political culture, and different political results that ensure that us, the people, are center and front of all the decision making that happens in the country. So that's Lucy, for me, where the big problematic is.
Thank you very much for that, Jana. It's very clear from what you're saying that as we identify our root cause, the root cause will also speak to the solutions or to the processes that we need to go through in order to have solutions. So for me, if the root cause is a political one, we need a political solution to get results. And it's very clear from what you have articulated. And it's good that when we identify the problem, we also know which remedy to apply. I'll move over to Malaika and ask you about the violence. When you were unpacking the crisis for you in your own perspective, you indicated that in Zimbabwe there appears to be a crisis that has culminated to a culture of violence that is systematic and violence that appears to be state-sponsored. And that violence mainly affects women and children, where women's bodies or women's spaces like vending areas end up being the battlefields for whatever is happening. So I would want to know from you that these problems, how do they affect the democratic rights of Zimbabwean citizens, be it Zimbabweans living in Zimbabwe or Zimbabweans living in diaspora? How are their rights affected by such culture of violence?
Thank you very much. So the rights of Zimbabwean people, both at home and in the diaspora, are being affected every single day by the Zimbabwean government and by the Zimbabwean state, as it were, right? In various ways. I mean, we've had some of the panelists here speaking about how they have lived in Bulawayo for the last 6 months and there has not been water for 6 months. I cannot imagine the level of violence, right, that a state facilitates when it denies people the very fundamental right to a fundamental resource that is water. Right, and I've been to Zimbabwe many times, right, and people in urban spaces even, right, have resorted to constructing wells and boreholes in their own yards and so on and so forth. But remember that the people who are able to do these things are often those whose positionality does not even reflect the reality of the men who are in Zimbabwe. You'll have to have at least $4,000 for you to be able to erect a borehole. You need to have some degree of some resources for you to be able to have a generator, for example, when ZESA continuously and persistently renders people without electricity for a long period of time. And as you correctly say, right, mothers who are at home taking care of children, taking care of families, and trying to hold families together, then have to negotiate and navigate all of these spaces of lack, right? All of this lack, the lack of electricity, the lack of water, and so on, right? And they have to navigate that, raising children, right? And that is why, for example, you will have, outbreaks of cholera, right? Diseases that ought not to even exist in the world today, diseases that are very easily treatable, but they can't be in Zimbabwe because the violence of the state is also such that it has denied public health and the public health system in Zimbabwe access to even the most basic of medication, the most basic of services. So children will then die of cholera because the government does not provide clean water, and then the government does not provide medical resources for these things to be resolved. So on an everyday basis, you see this violence in many ways. Another violence that then that expresses itself, that is facilitated by the state, is the violence of the arbitrary arrests, the arbitrary violence that it's meted out on young people. I'm a young person myself in South Africa, and I've been a student activist and a youth activist for a very long time, and I have never seen the kind, we had the Fees Must Fall protest in South Africa, for example, where the government and higher learning institutions unleashed a lot of violence on students and so on. But it was a moment in the passing that was reflective of that particular space and time. In Zimbabwe, every single week you open a newspaper, you speak to Zimbabwean comrades, young people are being arrested for protesting. You had comrades like Taku was arrested simply for protesting and saying you can't have a car rental agency that does not get held accountable when abductions are happening in their own vehicles and so on and so forth. And you arrest someone like that, a young person, president of Zinasu. But it's not the first time. It has continuously been happening in Zimbabwe that young people are being arbitrarily arrested, subjected to the most unimaginable forms of violence, right? And that is a manifestation of this violence that the states perpetuate, that it has made it impossible for young people to be activists, to be radical, and to even hold it accountable. But another violence that you also then see, right, is the violence of the helplessness that you see in the eyes of young Zimbabwean people when you are in Zimbabwe, who know that even if they may go to a higher learning institution, acquire a degree from University of Zimbabwe or NAST or Bindura University or whatever, they will still get out into a world that is not prepared to absorb them into a labor market that in Zimbabwe has basically almost all but collapsed, right? So it is violent. I mean, it's a violence that gets reflected generationally, right? Because if you're going to deny a young person an opportunity to make, to generate meaningful livelihood, it means that the offsprings of that person are going to be part of a cycle of poverty, of a cycle of lack, and so on. And so it's in the the functions of everyday life that you see this violence. You see it in the diaspora as well, right? I'm one of the people who are very, very clear and deliberate about fighting against the xenophobic violence in South Africa, which is very, very rife, right? Because South Africa is a largely very problematic country, a very, very violent, very, very Afrophobic, and so on, right? And I think it's deplorable that this is happening. But let's also have a very uncomfortable reflection on this, right? In as far as the complicity of the Zimbabwean state in the violence that we even see against Zimbabwean citizens in South Africa, is that when a state forces people, puts their backs against the wall and forces them to leave the country, right? Because Zimbabweans are not leaving Zimbabwe because they want to leave Zimbabwe, they want to explore opportunities out there, and this is happening in the presence of opportunities in Zimbabwe. They are doing so because it's the only way in which they can survive and the only way in which they can generate meaningful livelihoods and send remittances home to take care of their families, right? And they get into countries like South Africa, they get into countries like Botswana and all over the world and are subjected to unimaginably violent and xenophobic policies, xenophobic realities and experiences from citizens of these countries, right? And this is happening because the violence of the Zimbabwean state has forced people into a diaspora that is not necessarily very welcoming, but to go and contest very limited resources in that space with citizens of the host nations and so on. And so you begin to therefore see, and this is not to say we must not hold the South African government accountable for the violence. Absolutely we must, right? Because the South African government and South African people are complicit in the violence that also continues to happen in Zimbabwe. And I say this without fear of contradiction. Our government is complicit in the violence in Zimbabwe, and our people are complicit in the violence in Zimbabwe, if not for anything, with our people, if not for anything else, for the mere fact that we have sat on the sidelines and watched all of this violence happening and have not meaningfully engaged in being part of the solidarity work that is so necessary to assist Zimbabwean people to reclaim back their country. So the violence happens at home in Zimbabwe, the lack of public infrastructure, the lack of public service, the lack of public health, education, and all of that, the collapse of the education system and so on. But it then also happens in the diaspora, where the very fact that Zimbabweans are struggling so much in the diaspora, the very fact that Zimbabweans don't have an option but to be in a diaspora despite its very many problems, is a result and a function of a state that has failed its citizens. And that, for me, is how the violence manifests itself in everyday life.
Thank you, Malaika, for that detailed response where you touched on both the socio-economic rights and the civil and political rights that affect people when this culture of violence is perpetuated. I'd like to welcome the viewers and the listeners that have joined us now. But before I move to Kelly, so I realized that I had an oversight on my part. I forgot to have Jana introduce herself. So you can just do that briefly and tell us what you do. And then I also then come in and give Kelly so her question before I come back to you, Jana.
Oh my gosh, I was happy I escaped that. It's such a difficult job. But yes, I'm Jana Ncube. I'm a Zimbabwean, a Pan-Africanist, a governance expert. At the moment, my work is focused on international policy making around peace and security around the world. And I operate as an international consultant, but have a lot of fingers in a lot of initiatives in Zimbabwe that seek to make Zimbabwe a country that allows us to live dignified lives.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It helps our viewers and also us as people who are meeting with you for the very first time to know who you are and to associate what you do with your views. So I'll move to Samkeliso and Tabiso. You guys can choose who can take this question, because I really felt I need you to speak on this issue, since you mentioned the challenges that are faced by women in particularly Matabeleland and where you are coming from. And I was just thinking, could I probe you around the area of the issue of 50-50 in leadership positions? Seeing that this year we are commemorating the Beijing conference, I would also want to hear your views about the disparities. For example, I'll give you an example that I'm personally from Masvingo. And some of the problems that you guys have in Matabeleland, we don't have in Masvingo. So if you guys visit Masvingo, you can drink water from our taps. We have the cleanest water in the whole country, and we have water every day. Just that sometimes they then cut it off mid-morning or afternoon. And I'm thinking, could there be a link between the type of leadership that we have in that particular region, seeing that where there's no water, the gender roles, who is affected mainly are women. So I don't know, what would be your comment in terms of the socio-economic rights in this particular region, particularly the right to water and the right to health? Do you think it has to do with us as women not having women in the decision-making places? Are we there at the table where the decisions are making? And if you are not there, what do you think is the solution to this problem? If at all, failure to have women in decision-making processes is a direct contribution to the situation that we have now. Any of you can take it up.
Okay, I will try to articulate that question, and hoping that Samge will also come and aid into whatever input I would have put to the table. So to start with, like we said previously, that all the problems, the crisis it stems from political issues. I've been learning, I'm not really much acquainted with the subject, but I know that there's something around a Zambezi water project that was supposed to be initiated years back, and that wasn't done because of issues of corruption. It could have been a project that would have ensured that we have, Bulawayo it has self-sufficiency in terms of providing water. So it then goes back to really say that the root cause of such challenges are political, and it's a matter of bad governance. Like I like what Jana said when we began to say that the biggest crisis that we have is how the people have moved from being the center of everything. It's now a case of who gets to benefit what. It's now a case of the winner takes all, and people do not matter anymore, and people's lives do not matter anymore, and that's our biggest crisis. I've worked I actually work around health, so I know the challenges that women actually face. And I was laughing, like when you were asking that question, and I'm thinking I had this discussion yesterday where we were talking about issues to do with maternal mortality. And this guy, we're talking about health issues, and then this guy says, well, naturally, hospitals were not even created for men, they were created for women. But that's true. Of course, well, debatable, subject to debate. But if you look at issues to do with health and how the implications of a malfunctioning health system has an effect on women, it's very sad. It's very sad that today in Zimbabwe, we have a maternal mortality that's around 614 per every 100,000 live births. And somebody looks at it and thinks that, oh, maybe it's too low a number. It's too low a number when we're talking about women's lives, when we're talking about humans, when we're talking about lives. One life is so much. And when you're now talking about having such a high rate of maternal mortality, and then someone is embezzling funds that are supposed to go towards strengthening the health system. We have the case of COVID-19 that we all know of, where funds were embezzled. Those are funds that were supposed to come and complement and support the health system that is already in tatters. But then at the end of the day, you have people working scot-free because they know they have access to money. They know they have access to health tourism, whereby they know when they are not feeling well, they can go and seek treatment and seek quality treatment outside the country at the expense of a general citizen in Zimbabwe, at the expense of a civil servant, at the expense of a woman. And it's really, really, really sad, especially when we're talking about those issues. I have a particular interest in maternal health and neonatal child health. And you look at it and you see how women die every day, how babies die every day, and you're saying, pregnancy is not a disease that a woman should die. But at the end of the day, no one is saying anything. No one is doing anything. You get into a facility that doesn't even have that urine tests for BP, and someone succumbs to blood pressure because there isn't anything to detect that they have a high blood pressure, so they need to be rendered a certain service. They need such and such emergency service. You go to the rural hospitals, the health facilities, the ambulances are sitting on top of rocks because somebody doesn't care somewhere, because they know that they are covered. So I think it really goes back to say that at the end of the day, we as women face the music. We as women are the ones who then face this crisis. As I say, that it wears the face of a woman, but at the end of the day, we are also at a position where we are so comfortable, where we have so much told ourselves, no, it's okay, we will just hang in there. At the end of the day, sometimes you don't have to hang in there. Sometimes you have to give up, and giving up will help you reflect differently, and maybe giving up will make us to start seeing the wrongs, because right now everything looks normal. The problem is we have normalized things that are not even supposed to be normal at all.
Thank you very much. I think, Samkeli, so if you have a comment on that, you can also comment before we move on to the next round of questions.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to speak on when you asked about the 50-50 leadership. And what I've noticed that we as women have made this mistake, and spaces where they are comfortable with having men taking more than half, of those positions. And for me now, I'm always thinking about if I'm going to join a political party, I won't be comfortable with women not taking those spaces. We need to see more women in these spaces. We need to have more than 50%, because the Constitution speaks on gender equality, speaks on having 50-50, but we're still not seeing it. And I always say to people, the reason why we're not seeing it is because we're not calling the political parties to account. We can't expect to see women in parliament and seeing women in the Senate, but when we fail to fix our political parties, when we're failing to see those same women in political parties being given, not even given, but taking those positions, leadership positions in political spaces, how is it going to work? So for me, I think as women, we need to push political parties. We can't accept and we can't elect political parties that don't have the agenda that we have of seeing 50-50. Because I think we're playing as women if we keep pushing to see women in leadership spaces when in Zimbabwe we're using we're electing people through political parties. How is it going to happen? And then to speak on Bulawayo and Matabele, that I feel like with Bulawayo, we've relaxed as well. You know, we're known to have the cleanest water, but I feel like we're just lying to ourselves, we're deceiving ourselves, you know, because Bulawayo always has water crisis, you know, and we need to be honest about that, and we need to bring our leaders to account. You know, like right now there's a debate, okay, the NCC that runs city council, and then someone will say, no, but the local government is run by the minister and the person is from ZANU-PF. Like there's so much debate that goes on. And for me, I'm no longer comfortable about that, you know, because at the end of the day, what we are facing as Bulawayo or Matabeleland, there's nothing to do with MDC or ZANU-PF. It affects each and every person. So we need to think about our politics. We need to think about, you know, using a woman's face, you know, when we talk about issues, using a girl's face when we talk about issues in Zimbabwe, so that they know that all these issues, they affect women and they affect girls. So for me, we need to think about, we need to be honest as citizens of Zimbabwe. We need to be honest as citizens of Bulawayo and Matabeleland. You know, are we electing people because they have the same, they speak the same language as me? Like for recently, like when you try to speak to the water issue, you are called a radical activist, you know. And also when you speak against, when you try to have a conversation with the town clerk, no one is happy because no, you're now speaking to the Ndebele people, I'm Ndebele. And you're like, how are we going to solve this issue if we're going to protect certain individuals that we're supposed to call to account? You know, we need to be honest. We need to push each and every person, whether the person's NCC, whether the person speaks the same language as me, because at the end of the day, the people who are suffering is us, you know, not the politicians. So we need to do something about it. But as for 50-50 women, please, we need to push for political parties. We need to speak to people like Nelson Chamisa to say, okay, you say that you are different from ZANU-PF. How come we don't see more women in spaces in NCC? You know, we need to speak to each and every opposition party and not always think that the issue is with ZANU-PF. I like what Jana said when she mentioned that, you know, with Zimbabwe, our biggest issue as well is our system, our institutions, everything is rotten. Like there's nothing, like there's no political party that I can say, okay, I would like to join, I would like to participate in, because every political party is doing the same thing, that is calling ZANU out for, you know. So we as Zimbabweans, can we please sit down and be honest with ourselves and say, okay, this we can't accept just because it's NCC that's propagating for change. But if you are behaving like ZANU-PF, then it's time for us to move, you know. So that, for me, that's what I think we need to think about as Zimbabweans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Samkeliso. I also have some questions with me that have been asked by the citizens, that has been asked by the people that are part of our show. And one of the questions, I'll direct the question to Thabiso. The women in Zimbabwe, or rather the citizens in Zimbabwe, would want to know what the woman who's in the grassroots can do to also be part of these conversations that we are having. What is it that the women that are in the grassroots can also do so that they also contribute, so that their voice is also heard, so that they also become part of the solution? What is it that you think should be done, especially by the women in the grassroots?
Okay, thank you so much for that question, Lucy. I think that women from the grassroots can organize and be part of, there are a lot of structures at community level, at grassroots level, that we can participate in as young women, as women. And then we need to find ourselves at a position where we organize ourselves, where we become part of those conversations so that we can also contribute. I'll give an example of the health setup, which I'm very much familiar with. I know, like, at local communities, there are structures like the health center committees and so forth and so forth. So these are the platforms that women can also fight to be part of, because I know they are very much male dominated. In rural areas, women are just reduced, not really, okay, for lack of a better term, they're just then told, you know, your place probably is being a village health worker, and because of the gender roles that are associated with care work, and then there are platforms where there are decisions that are made that then are assumed to be then the space for males. So I think as women, we need to organize ourselves. We need to, and also civil society at grassroots level has a very huge role to play in terms of capacity building, in terms of educating the girl child, in terms of mobilizing the girls to participate. We need to get to a point where we realize the role of women's leadership in certain areas, in certain issues. It's quite unfortunate, however, that when we have to talk about CSO, the space for civil society has been shrinking lately. I think mainly due to state interference and all, because you know, you find that CSO plays a role as a watchdog. CSO is supposed to bring government to account, and at the end of the day, CSO plays that role to ensure that there's transparency, and which is exactly what the government of the day is not really appreciating, and they take that every move by CSO to try and foster accountability is a direct attack, and there's a lot of paranoia, and there's a lot of repression within that sector, but it's very sad. So I think that we really need to come to a point whereby as CSOs, as community-based organizations, community actors, we need to start capacity building our young girls. Why I refer to young girls, I know I'm talking to women generally, but at the end of the day, we also need to look into the future and not just today. So we need to start capacity building our young people, capacity building our young girls to be active citizens, to be citizens who want to inquire, to be citizens who have got an interest in the current state of affairs, who question things, who question, who ask, who probe, who interrogate, and be the citizens who also know, who are educated, who can offer solutions, not just to point out challenges, but who are able to say, okay, fine, we have identified those challenges. And if they have to come to a point where they're asked, what do you propose as a solution? They're able to speak out, they're able to share solutions that can ensure that we have a generation of young people, we have a generation of young women who are empowered, who are taking up space, who are changing things, who are shaking up things for the better of the country.
Thank you very much, Thabiso. You speak about people being paranoid, and also us as women, and us as Women's Academy for Leadership and Political Excellence to continue with the mentorship, to continue empowering women. I'm saying to continue because at the beginning of the program, I mentioned mentorship as one of the things that our organization is doing to make sure that women also participate in these spaces. I think before we close, I would also want Malaika to comment on the challenges that the host countries are facing in terms of the high immigration and the number of Zimbabweans that live outside Zimbabwe. I would also just maybe want to hear your comment on the challenges that host countries are also facing as a result of the Zimbabwean crisis, because we realize that once we are in a crisis, it also affects our neighbors in different ways. I would also want you to just say something about the problems that also comes with a crisis in your neighboring country. Malaika, if you can unmute yourself.
Oh, yes, of course. Thank you very much. I did not realize I was muted. So I'm saying that for me, the question is a bit of a problematic one, and it's in this sense, right? I don't believe that South Africa and other countries that host to Zimbabweans in the diaspora are facing the kind of challenges often are reported, right? And I mean, of course, we can make an argument about the problems with regards to the overburdening of the public infrastructure, right? I mean, for example, in South Africa, access to basic healthcare is a fundamental human right. It has got no, it does not matter whether you are a Zimbabwean citizen, Zimbabwean national, or so on, whether you're even documented or not, right? You would be able to access public healthcare and so on. There's often been an argument that has been made that, a lot of Zimbabweans then coming to utilize these public facilities are overburdening the system and so on. And I think to a particular degree, such are valid and reasonable arguments. But I also think that there are arguments that are a cop-out, right? And they are a cop-out for me in the sense that I think that in wanting to move the focus specifically to the so-called burden that is being created by Zimbabweans, we shift away from the responsibility of holding our governments, both the South African government and the Zimbabwean government, accountable for the mess in Zimbabwe and for the crisis that pertains even in South Africa. I think that we need to be very deliberate in asserting, right, as it were, that the South African government is complicit in the crisis in Zimbabwe. It is complicit in that it has in the past when, Zimbabwean opposition and Zimbabwean people have requested, its intervention in the situation to say, look, provide a meaningful intervention. We sit right now with the president who is we've said even before this, with the president who was chairing the SADC, and we've done so even in the recent past and so on, and as well as the African Union. And there has not been a deliberate attempt on these persons to place the question of Zimbabwe at the top of the agenda of engagement for the region, right? Now, what that does is that it creates a situation in which the ZANU-PF government in Zimbabwe operates with the belief, and perhaps a very correct belief, right, that it has got the support of the South African government and the support of all governments in the region. And that is how it then is able to perpetuate this reign of terror that it is doing. So the so-called crisis of the Zimbabwean burden on the South African infrastructure or any other infrastructure is, for me, only one aspect of the conversation. Of course, it is true that we've got a lot of people who are in the country and are going to rely on the resources that are limited in a South Africa that also has got its own problems. You are going to see a confluence of many other issues. But I don't think that that is where the discussion must end. The discussion must also go into saying then that if the South African government truly believes that the Zimbabwean population that is here is a crisis and a burden to its infrastructure, what then must it be doing to ensure that such a problem does not permeate? Because quite frankly, you're not going to stop having this so-called Zimbabwean burden in South Africa if you're not going to make any meaningful intervention to resolve the crisis in Zimbabwe, because you would not then have a reason to have Zimbabweans migrating into South Africa and elsewhere in the diaspora. So I do think that it's a question that is filled with far more nuances than simply saying Zimbabweans are a burden in this regard. But also, Zimbabweans are not just a burden in South Africa, and we must move away from that kind of thinking that says that having a lot of Zimbabweans in the country creates a burden. The reality of the situation is that the South African economy survives and always has survived on the range of diversity that is brought about in our country by persons from other countries. And this is true of both the formal and the informal economy, right? The South African informal economy is a very big economy, and that is where a lot of Zimbabwean migrants participate in that informal economy. It gives jobs to people in our country. It sustains the livelihoods of people in our country. In the formal economy as well, Zimbabweans are working in very key institutions in South Africa, in the private sector and elsewhere, and they are doing meaningful work that is contributing to the growth of our own GDP and the stability of South Africa as a country. So the Zimbabweans are not here only as a burden. They are making meaningful interventions in making our country a better country, but they're bringing also a lot of diversity and skills and things that we don't have in our country that are clearly paying dividends in our country, right? We see for example, in the South African higher education system, a lot of Zimbabwean academics are in that space, and that is why South Africa can have a quality of education that it is renowned for on the continent, right? Because of this diversity that is being brought, because of the skills and expertise that are being brought into the country. And so for me, I think it is not it is not simply a question of burden and so on. We also need to look at the many other positive aspects that come into the country as a result of Zimbabweans being here and many other nationalities in South Africa. But we also then, like I said, ultimately need to be able to hold the South African government accountable for its own role in the facilitation of a situation in which the ZANU-PF government is able to sustain a reign of terror on Zimbabwean people, because no one on the continent is holding them accountable, and institutions that ought to be doing so, that is particularly SADC and the African Union, are not playing their part.
Thank you very much, Malaika. That's very clear. In a crisis, it's not everything that is really bad, or it's not everything that is bad, and we should also not oversee the state obligations. Zimbabwe still has an obligation to its citizens, and South Africa still has obligations by being part of the SADC and the African Union, and also just aiding and enabling the current government of Zimbabwe. We are about to end our meeting, so I'll just go back to Jana, and we just go round. I'll give you guys time to wrap up, to say what you think about the discussion that we've been having. But I want you to, in your closing remarks, to be able to address the issue of what we need to do as women so that we are also heard. What is it that we need to do so that we are also part of the table and we make contributions that are meaningful?
Thanks for that, and for this really, I think, stimulating conversation. I will quote a great Pan-Africanist, a friend, Tajudini, who since passed away, who said to Africa, don't agonize, organize. And I think my fellow panelists have said this in different forms and shape. That is, women, we need to organize ourselves. We need to recognize that we need to work together across our different divides, be they political, be they social, be they economic, because at the end of the day, the challenges that this country is facing, we are all experiencing and facing. And so that it's really important that we activate our agency and come together and mobilize and connect with sisters in other countries and enjoy the solidarity. That's really quite important. And I also really want to challenge all of us who are in various leadership roles. I think one of the questions, Lucy, you asked was, how should ordinary women in the rural areas, in the communities, participate? I really want to challenge women's organizations. I've led several in this country, and I think we really ought to recognize that as women's organizations, we have the responsibility and the opportunity to create platforms for ordinary women across this country to be organized and to be able to help harness their voices and channel them through the various spectrums of discussion on discourse on the solutions for this country. So it's really quite important that we do that, and also really challenge women leaders in the various political parties across this country who are holding positions of power and privilege to preside over issues that, even though they are there nominated by their parties, but by the virtue of the dynamic that exclusion breeds for women as a people, they are there too as our representatives and as our voice. And we expect them to engage us as women and as a constituency that they emerge out of, that they need to engage us and ensure that they are taking our issues and they're taking our issues to the different spaces where discussions about the future of this country are being held. Thank you.
Thank you very much for those closing remarks, Jana. I'll also then move to Malaika so that you give your last words to our viewers and our listeners.
Sorry, I have unmuted. Sorry about that. I'm going to re-emphasize and really just agree with what Jana has just said now, right, about the necessity and the need for organizing and mobilization. Because I mean, ultimately, like I made the argument earlier on, there really is no such thing as liberators, right? The people of Zimbabwe are the ones that are going to liberate themselves. The liberation of Zimbabwe is not going to come from the ZANU-PF, and it's definitely not going to come from the NCC, right? This idea that a Nelson Chamisa is going to come and liberate Zimbabwe, or an even now is going to come and liberate Zimbabwe is not, it's not going to be, it's not a practical or workable idea, right? Zimbabwean people themselves in Zimbabwe and in the diaspora are the ones who are going to lead the charge for the emancipation of Zimbabwe. And so I do think that work around organizing and mobilizing becomes very, very critical, and especially for women. And I think particularly for women in the rural areas, precisely because 60% or so of them are, you know, or 60% or so of Zimbabwe is constituted of people in rural areas, the majority of whom are also women, right? So there needs to be a very deep investment in capacitating and in aiding in availing resources for organizations that are led by women that are doing meaningful work, both in the rural and urban space. And I think that is also where the role of the diaspora, all of us who are deeply invested in the Zimbabwean cause, that is where our role then becomes, right? That how do we bring our resources together, our networks together, to ensure that we assist in this building of movements, but that we also avail the resources for these movements. So I do think that, I mean, ultimately, that's a very correct argument, that there isn't going to be any liberation of Zimbabwe, of Zimbabwe and Zimbabwean people in the absence of the very deliberate and the systematic and the planned and sustainable creation of movements that are going to obviously fight a political program, but located outside of the conventional political setup that is defined by political organizations and political parties, which tend to be very polarizing in their manner, right? And so Zimbabweans as ordinary people need to start being part of these movements, and we in the diaspora, Zimbabweans in the diaspora and we in host countries need to then aid in practical solidarity work insofar as availing resources and availing platforms for this mobilization and organizing to occur.
Thank you very much, Malaika. Over to you, Sam Kelly. So if you can just, under a minute, give us your closing remarks or your last words to our viewers and listeners.
Okay, thank you, Lucy. For me, I think we need to make each and every person understand that political independence and economic independence will not be given to us on a free platter, because we're dealing with a government that wants to keep resources for itself, for the elite. So we need to fight for political independence. We need to fight for economic independence. We need to make our government very uncomfortable. For me, that's the first thing, that we need to make our government uncomfortable so that they realize that they are there because of us. What makes a nation sovereign is because it's the people. It's not the elite, it's us, the people, it's us, the majority. And what makes democracy is us, not the other way around. And the other thing, we need to make sure that our platforms are inclusive, rural women, rural areas. We need to get their voices as well, because we should not assume that every woman is the same and every experience is the same. It's not the same. So can we get more platforms, that will include those women, that will include girls as well, because they're that are not going to school. They're the ones that are getting pregnant because of being at home. As we learned that because of COVID-19, so many girls got pregnant. So we need to include the voices of girls as well. We should not just exclude them from these platforms. And also we need to, as women organizations, we need to start thinking about consciousness and engaging with each and every woman, because like what I've learned, that when we talk about economic independence, when we talk about mismanagement of public finances, much debt we always the state. They have no idea. So we need to really start pushing people to really be conscious of these things, so that when we talk about the crisis in Zimbabwe, they know exactly what they're dealing with, because we always speak to people that have no clue as to how much debt that we owe as a state, how much debt we owe as a nation. Because the debt that we have as a state should have been going to social service delivery, but it's not. So can we please push for women to know what's going on, and not assume that just because we spoke to Sangedis or we spoke to Jana, we spoke to Malaika, then it means every woman knows. It's not realistic. There's so much work that needs to be done by women organizations, and we can't really rely on political parties, because as we have seen that people, when they saw with the new dispensation, they assume that the problem was Mugabe. Then you realize that in Zimbabwe, the issue is very systemic. So, and we can't assume that everyone knows that, because right now you have people that are pushing for ED to go and not understanding that the issues are deeper. It won't be changed by Chamisa, it won't be changed by Nkosana, it won't be changed by any other, because the issues are very deep, and we need to start dealing with those causes. Otherwise, we'll be complaining in the next 50 years. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Kelly. So Tabi, so last but not least, can you give the listeners and the viewers your last words?
Okay, thank you so much, Lucy. I think my last words would be what we have already talked about in terms of organizing, in terms of mobilizing. Not only to just look at all things negative, I think that on the positive side, we have a window for us as women to be able to participate in political spaces. But I still feel like a window is not enough. I still feel like we need to ask for more. I still feel like we do not just need to be comfortable by being said to come and bring something to the table. I think it's high time we start setting the tables ourselves. I think it's high time we start creating those tables and setting them and directing so that we can be able to then move the motions that we want to move according to how we want to, according to how we set our agendas as women and what we really feel are the solutions for women. So I think we need to mobilize, we need to strategize as women, and we need to organize at the end of the day, also set clear agendas and also our leaders to account, and also be accountable to each other, be accountable to one another before we ask the world, before we ask the men to start addressing our issues or accounting to us. We need to also account to each other, and we also need to be our sisters keepers. We need to do away with this whole business of selective solidarity, and we need to ensure that we give unconditional solidarity across political lines. If we feel that this is an attack to women, we need to stand together as women and ensure that we fight for each other so that we can claim our space. Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you very much, Tabiso. What I hear from all of our panelists is that we need solidarity, we need to continue networking, and we need to continue with the dialogues. And on that note, I just want to comment and thank the National Citizens Convention for the continued platforms that they provide for women and for other citizens to have these discussions. We really hope that this is something that will continue, as Sam Kelly so said, to say, you know what, we need to go to the grassroots, we need to go to the rural areas and speak to each and every woman and hear what they are doing. And also to the Women's Academy for Leadership and Political Excellence, we also want to thank you for having this at heart, to identify future leaders, to nurture them and to mentor them. We really hope that the discussions that we had today are fruitful and they will cumulate to what Bati said when we started, that at the end of the day, we are going to see solutions to what we all aspire to see. Otherwise, thank you very much for having time to be with us and for hosting this discussion. Thank you. Over to you, Bati.
Thank you, Lucy.
Thank you, Lucy. I think she has just said it all. Like I said in the beginning, this is a part of the process where we're going to produce a position paper, which we'll share with you all. Thank you for joining us at this call and for the very insightful conversations that we had this morning. Thank you so much, and goodbye to you all.